pleasure to introduce Marlon Blackwell to Georgia Tech. He's been here before once, maybe twice? Once. And it's always a pleasure to hear him talk about his buildings. It's an extra pleasure because I'm an alumnus of the University of Arkansas, where Marlon is now the chair, soon to be out of the chair job, I understand, but has been a chair for the last 5 years. He's also been recently appointed the Fay Jones Distinguished Professor of Architecture at the University of Arkansas at the School of Architecture, and has received multiple awards, AIA National Design Awards in 2012 and 2013, and the Architecture Award from the National Institute of Arts and Letters, I think in 2013. With that, only one other thing. I first met Marlon, I've known for a long time now, while I was riding the bicycle downhill to the Dudok City Hall in Hilversum, probably 10 years ago or more. So, welcome to Marlon, and the turnout with this lecture may propel us to go ahead next year and do 2 p.m. lectures to get the studios involved. Immediately after this, Marlon will be in the cave in Hinman for a session of questions and answers by students. That will go on as long as we can keep Jude and Charles away from him to take to the studios. And that's something that we plan to do next year, is have questions and answers with the visiting lecturers after the studio, after the lecture, each time we do a Wednesday studio. Marlon Blackwell.
Thank you. All right. Let's see. Going to show me how to do that, David? Go. Thank you. All right. All good. All right. Well, welcome everybody. This is an experiment. I think this is the earliest lecture I've ever done. So, and I just have one of those giant burgers at Bocado. So if I keel over off the stage in the middle of all this, please forgive me. I'm comfortably numb at the moment from red meat and cheese. Anyways, great to be back in Atlanta. Great to get out of the state of Arkansas for a little bit and visit. I wanted to just sort of start off with, I always start off every lecture like this with my favorite building, which is what we call the Jesus Barn, or the God Barn, and right outside of Fayetteville, Arkansas, which for me is a quintessential example of the singular and the universal, and the sacred and the prosaic, that which is reverent and irreverent in our built environment that we're constantly drawing upon in the work that we do. Now, I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself, just so to give you a little bio, because I really believe that everybody is shaped by their experiences, who they've met in life, the type of work you've done, places you've traveled, all of that kind of act to shape you. So I'm from Alabama originally, but I was born in Germany. My father was in the military at the time. Gotten to see, live in a lot of different parts of the world, in the States. I grew up loving to draw. In fact, I had this idea that I would become a cartoonist, because that's what I love to do. I love to draw cartoons and create narratives around cartoon characters, and I was really intent on doing that up until I was, and I read an article that said a lot of cartoonists have alcohol problems. And I said, man, I don't want to have alcohol problems, so I'll become an architect. By the laughter, yeah, there are issues there too. So, we'll work through all that. I grew up somewhat in Florida, right near the Everglades, so I grew up with a real love for nature. And simultaneously a real fear of nature too. If you spend any time in nature, if you don't have a healthy fear of it, you're somewhat psychotic, I think. Wasn't particularly athletic, but I was a high school wrestler when I lived in Colorado, and had a storied career there as a 105-pound wrestler, the same height that I am now, but half the weight. Kind of looked like Barney Fife in tights. I wrestled a bear once. It's a long story. I won't go into it. I did get my ass kicked, needless to say. I went on to Auburn University in architecture, not knowing a whole lot about architecture, never read a book on architecture, didn't even know who Frank Lloyd Wright was. I just kind of thought, well, being architecture might be a cool thing. And I came from a family that, we didn't have a lot of money, modest background. If I was going to go to college, I was going to have to earn my way through it. So I came upon this program out of Nashville, Tennessee, that you work during the summer and you can make money by selling Bibles door to door in the rural South. And so I was a Bible salesman for 5 summers working my way through architecture school at Auburn. And I did pretty well. Of course, what was amazing about it is the opportunity to be placed in parts of the South that you only read about. And being immersed in the culture and with the people and the food and the landscape. I mean, it was a really shaping, formative experience. And of course, cultivating what every Southerner should have was a skill of telling stories, listening to stories. So it was really a formative thing. And then at one of the awards banquets, I got to meet this guy. I won an award, and he was there to present the awards. And anyway, so my students call me Dirk Diggler. Kind of finally survived 70s fashion, only to discover it's now coming back around. I put most of this away in the closet, thankfully. A lot of mileage since then. But I've always felt, only having this photo, the only photo I have with a politician, and being somewhat politically independent, I always felt like my chi was out of balance for like 30, 40 years. And I was like, God, how can I get my chi back in balance? How can I maintain this balance that I look for in life? So last year, I ran into this guy, and I explained to him my dilemma, and he said, well, I think I can help you with that. And we got this photograph. Anyway, everything's doing great now, so it's hopefully all uphill. So, or downhill, whichever it may be. So I live, practice, and teach and build in Northwest Arkansas, which we like, Arkansas we like to call the land of Bill and a billion chickens. We have a great chicken industry there, of course. But what I really like about the chickens is these chicken houses, and you find them all over, thousands, all over Northwest Arkansas in particular. Long, slender metal buildings that light up at night. They look like almost like an ode to Dan Flavin when you see them in the landscape. But what I really like about them is when you see them in the landscape, you almost always know where you are because they're almost always oriented east-west. Because the chicken farmers figured out pretty quickly that if you could minimize the sun exposure on the east and west side, that you could actually prevent the chickens from cooking before their time. So I love the common sense nature of that and the directness of that, and that's a lot of what we try to put into our own work and what we're doing in our place. And of course, the Ozarks are, Fayetteville's in the heart of the Ozarks, as is Walmart and Tyson and J.B. Hunt and all these other companies. And it's a place, I would say, that can be defined by lots of terms like abandonment, exploitation, erasure, nostalgia. And those are conditions, I think, that are no more real than the local form and natural beauty you'll find there. And there's a lot of natural beauty, and there's also a lot of real constructed ugliness just as well. And where I live at really is a place of disparate conditions, but it's not just a setting for our work, it's really become part of our work. And so we don't really see that as a negative. What we see it is as a deep source of possibilities in direct experience with the world as it's given to us. And so what we've been able to do is to choose to stay, and I've been there for the last 23 years, and work in what I like to call the Ozark Outback. And what we've been able to do is turn over the rock and discover the underbelly of our place and all the visceral presences and expressive character that really informs and sustains our work there. And I'm working from a very simple conviction that architecture is larger than the subject of architecture. And what we do is put on a wide-angle microscopic lens to examine the world, to develop actions and ideas from our concrete experiences of the everyday. between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between one's own personal history and the history of our discipline. You may recognize this building on the left. This is the masterwork of E. Jones, who was a good friend and mentor. Thorncrown Chapel, which is located in Eureka Springs, just about an hour outside of Fayetteville. I think this was voted by the National AIA or something as the 4th best building of the 20th century built in the U.S. And we take everybody there. Every architect like myself who would come to Atlanta and comes to Fayetteville, we take there. So we've had Mr. Eisenman has been there, of course, and Liebskin and Peter Zumthor and Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron and all, and they all have a very similar experience and reaction to this small work. In many ways, it's architecture at the highest level. Now, just across the town there in Eureka is something we call the Passion Play, and it's another icon in Northwest Arkansas. It's where you come and see the life of Christ acted out by actors and such. And of course, they had this dream of building this really super tall statue of Jesus that could be seen for miles. But when they went to build it, they discovered that the FAA was going to require a flashing blue light on the top of his head. And of course, they didn't want that. But rather than redesign him, all they did is just lop him off at his knees and push him back into the ground. And so he has these proportions of a milk carton. So we affectionately call him Milk Carton Jesus. That's, anyways, so here are two icons that sort of define our place in a way. Just to illustrate the conditions we work between the highs and lows of culture perhaps, but at the same time, we don't see that as a necessity to resolve one to the other, but in fact to develop resonance between these two conditions with the things that we make. So we're constantly mindful of possibilities working between the ideal in our discipline and the more improvised in our discipline. And what we've been able to do is really get involved in what I like to call the task of recreating strangeness. We are constantly looking at how we might represent the world as it's given to us into the world as we find it. And so we've developed a series of operations just looking at what's given to us, in this case, a barn in which we can perform a type of Gordon Matta Clark and sort of reprogram, resituate it, and represent it in a way that is both, like I said, singular and universal, something that is at once connected to its place and yet strangely disconnected. And so the strangely familiar is something that creates a doorway for us into both a local discourse and a more global discourse, and has really sort of allowed us to populate, let's say, the land with a small body of. Here's an example. So we were approached by a congregation of Eastern Orthodox Christians who were worshiping in a rundown building in Springdale, Arkansas, a small town right near Fayetteville. And one of their members had died, left them some money, and they immediately went out and bought 3.5 acres along the interstate because they really wanted to have their own sanctuary, their own fellowship hall, and they just really needed a place of some dignity to worship in. They didn't have a lot of money once they bought the land, which they had, I think, about $100 a square foot. So they approached us and said, could you build something for us? And we, of course, oh yeah, because we take the attitude we can do anything, of course. You see it here. This is the property. These large red rectangles are the mega churches that surround it. And this is the interstate here, which they wanted to be seen and hold their own. So we said, okay, great. And then the next thing they dropped on us was, and we want to build this for $100 a square foot. Of course, we're like, whoa. And yeah, maybe if we built it all out of 3/4 plywood or something, And of course, I wanted to illustrate to them, just like show them these images of adventures in religious architecture where I live. The metal building with the ubiquitous cross put on it. Now, I grew up a Southern Baptist. I know the whole shtick there about you can worship anywhere and all that. But this is a congregation that is very much into the more aestheticized form of worship, one that really hangs to its traditions and its rituals and its icons, its symbols. And I always found this kind of interesting, these situations, because most people wouldn't live in a building like this. And it's really interesting to see them pull up on Sunday mornings in their SUVs and large cars that actually, some of them cost more than the building itself. So I always just find it a weird, strange set of values that allow us to do this sort of thing. So I thought I had been pretty convincing with them that we can't go this route, even though we don't have the money for this route. And they said, well, that's all very fine, but we only have $100 a square foot, and we would like for you to convert this welding shop into our church. And we said, oh, you mean like the footprint, like we'll tear it down and we'll build a church on it? No. This came with the property, and this is where we'd like to start. It's already got structure. Of course, our hearts sank. We're like, what the hell is going on here? So we decided to go back to origins. Decided to go back to the beginnings of the Greek Orthodox Church and really look at something that is relatively inexpensive and for free. And that's the fundamental things we're supposed to learn here at architecture. Things like proportion, scale, things like being able to understand the nature of abstraction somewhat. So all of those things we sort of delved into, and we developed a whole new church that was all based in Greek proportioning, golden mean, that we could present to them and say, well, this is really what you find in the origins of your own church. And they, of course, immediately were sort of infatuated with it, but at the same time, like, wow, this is very different than anything we wanted. But it had everything they asked for: the symbols, the colors, the icons, and all of this kind of compressed into a facade, almost billboard-like, to the interstate. And then, of course, we always throw in a little bit of corb. A little bit of corb goes a long way in every project. So mix that in. How did we do this? Well, quite simply, what we did is added about 10 feet to the front of the metal building because we needed to develop a narthex, north-south, to get us back on the east-west axis through the sanctuary right here, which is very important to their form of worship. We had operable walls that opened into the fellowship hall for certain services during the year that might have overflow. And again, we wrapped the existing metal building with a new metal skin, a box rib metal skin off the rack that we customized the corners and trim and get a seamlessness to that. And so it's a true American double skin system. So just Germany, eat your heart out. So here we go. And we really take the craft of these sort of off-the-shelf systems very seriously. We course everything with the ribs, windows and doors. That is actually the exit door here. This tells you where it is. Right there, it's all embedded. So there is a high degree of reductivity to bring the emphasis to the profile. Everything that I pretty much design operates in profile and section as a type of visage. And then we light it up at night. And has quite a presence from the interstate. So a section through, the narthex, where we have Father John's office. We have the return air duct. It's really made of local white oak with a counter with a steel beam that cantilevers. The beam is filled with sand. Candles go into the sand you pick up before you come to the axis, bathed in the blood of Christ, and then enter into the sanctuary. And here's just that little narrow gasket of a space up into the tower. We mix some colors. Again, it doesn't cost a whole lot to bring in some light and mix it up a little bit to get a necessary effect of the spiritual. Moving through and then into the sanctuary. And we cut one slot on the east elevation right through the old metal building to bring in some eastern light. They have an iconostasis all made out of angle iron for all of their icons. The whole walls now are covered in icons. And of course the dome with the pantocrator and the altar behind. And so there's Father John here with his regalia. And of course the dome was very important to these folks. We couldn't put a dome on top of the building because you had the superstructure, right? We couldn't carve into that. So we convinced them to let us put the dome in the plenum, but the dome of respect for them, the fiberglass dome, they could not afford. They did not have the money. And the contractor was really worried that he couldn't custom make one that would, be presentable. So what to do? So he got to scratching his head, the contractor did, and said, I have a friend about 20 miles out in the mountains that I know for 2 cases of beer, I can trade for a satellite dish. And you have to understand, we're in the middle of construction here. So We get this satellite dish and we truck it back in, as you can see, under construction, and it's its own natural laugh. You can laugh if you want. I mean, it's good. It's just your own natural, its own natural laugh. So we skim coated it with plaster, and we jacked it up on the scissor lift, and they have their dome. There you go. So that's how we roll in Arkansas, right? There's a will, there's a way. Now, one of the building members was really, just really in charge by this possibility of repurposing, and he said, I know where we can get a bishop's chair, a large wooden walnut throne-like with crushed purple velvet upholstery, and I can get it for free. And I said, really, where? And he goes, well, it's part of an ad campaign at a local liquor store. But when they're done, I can get it for free. He said, I just don't know what we're going to do with that embroidered CR on the chair. I said, what do you mean? He goes, Crown Royal. I was like, oh. And Father John happened to overhear us, and he came over and he says, well, why not Christ the Redeemer? So, that's how we roll, right? So figure it out. So, any event, 2013, we got a call from the National AIA Honor Awards program director. I think her name is Elizabeth Henry. And she called and she let us know that this had won a National AIA Honor Award. Of course, we're all very excited. But she said, I want you to know, too, that we did a little research. And we discovered that this is the least expensive building ever given a National Honor Award in the history of our awards program. And so it really underscored to us what our mission was in many ways and why we're out in the middle of Arkansas in some ways, is to demonstrate that architecture can happen anywhere, it can happen at any scale, and at any budget. And if anyone tells you any different here in the academy or out there in the profession, all I can say is bovine scatology. That's not true. And it's really much more about those things, the fundamentals, the things that we're learning. So part of what we're learning also, and have been working on for some time, our project, our meta project in a way, is trying to find analogous relationships between what is nature-made and what is culture. And using that too as a source for generating ideas and actions. And I remember when I first started out in Arkansas, I didn't have a lot of work, so I would invent projects, and I wanted to invent a series of prototypes that were about living in the American landscape that might rethink how we live in flood zones, or how we might create shade and those sorts of things, how we posit a building on the ground, and how we begin to combine vernaculars with those other emerging vernaculars that are often seen as the flotsam and jetsam of our landscape, things like campers or trailer homes or truck containers, all of those things that really make up a mobile technological society, combined with the vestiges of that old pre-industrial landscape that we're also romantic about. And we also love the natural components too. So looking at the selective characteristics of these two, the dragonfly and the camper, in an active architectural husbandry, began to get that together into what we like to call the dragon. Again, it sits lightly upon the land, makes its own shade. You can aim it anywhere. It's really a project in search of a site. And we made 3, 4, 5 of these. And the idea for me was to develop a language, to begin to develop a formal language that might come with a material, a logic, a bucket of ideas that could draw upon for when we might actually get commissions. So we're trying to prepare for that in some ways. And over the past 20-something years, we've developed a whole body of work looking at work in very often a very typological way, but with the idea that typologies are adaptive and evolutionary. They're not fixed. Because when typologies become fixed in our mind, they really start to become more about style. And that's this thing that we're really trying to evolve or avoid, because we really think of architecture as more situational. So these are some of the typologies we look at, everything from a shotgun to a villa to a trailer to a barn to a bridge. The kind of natural conditions that we've used to fold into these early projects that then fold into commissions that then fold into other subsequent commissions. So there's really progenitors and progeny here. And it's a meta project that we've been working on in our place for some time to develop a body of work to go with hopefully a discourse on that work. And as an architect, as I said, I develop everything in profile, everything as a visage. And so we've developed a type of lexicon of all, these are all the different projects that we've been working on, just a selected few to look at the variety of profiles and shapes that are non-parametric, believe it or not, but can still be fully potent, I say, filled with expressive character as they operate in the landscape and in the city. So one of the first buildings that we got to do was a 7-story house in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And I was, of course, looking at the local here, but I also drew upon my own experiences. I think everybody knows this as a student of architecture, that travel is a way to really, I would say, discipline the imagination. So places like Lucca or Yemen that I'd been to, I began to draw from in the thinking about how to make this house and how would it hit the ground. And I thought about what nature had provided us in the immediate site, the textures and patterns, and especially the striated bark of the white oaks and the hickory trees. And so we went and milled some of those trees to develop this white oak lattice thin envelope that surrounds a 50-foot high stairway courtyard and the top of wood delimits the mature height of the local white oaks. And so looking further, once you got above the trees, lots of pre-industrial and industrial and agricultural buildings that were towers in our landscape that were almost all detailed in white metal or white concrete panels. So we wanted to take part in that other order, so we developed our own thin, precise white metal skin that slips over the wood, which has been air dried, so it dances and it moves. And so you develop one's own system of articulation that is particular to its place. A small structure for a client of mine, not too far from here in Cashiers, North Carolina. I had the good fortune to do this client's house. She was actually the mother of my old girlfriend. So students, I just tell you this, if you get dumped in a relationship and that person asks you to at least be their friend, consider the possibilities. So I got a commission to do her mother's house, my very first project ever, and then 10 years later she had become a beekeeper and she'd asked me to come back and do a small structure for her to take honey out of the comb and put it in a centrifuge, purify it, put it in jars so that she could sell in the local market. And so this structure, 8 feet wide by 24 feet long, at a total cost of $40,000, was really the project that's put us on the map, our first major publication. Again, with that commitment that this could be architecture. And so one single element, which is just a steel wall, a steel plate wall of faceted glass, deep surface, that is a load-bearing wall. It's not a monolithic load-bearing wall, but a wall actually primarily made of voids that held up the structure, and then actually acts as a display and storage of the honey itself and a type of brise soleil. And then in the folding of the glass, we create spaces and pockets of space in which birds and small insects nest in. And so it's really something that's in a constant state of change in many ways. You never find it in the same state on any day. So that these sort of smaller projects began to help us understand a more formal language in its relationship to material and material logics. And then we got to scale up all of a sudden after a few projects. We had the opportunity to do one of the first modern golf clubhouses in the country in recent years. Approached by Mr. Tyson of Tyson Foods to do this clubhouse with the charge for it not to be another Terra or another hunting lodge. He said, I really want something that would look like it's from here, that like it's born of this place. And our site was on an Osage Indian archaeological zone, a preservation site, not an excavation site. They had negotiated to put 3 foot of engineered fill on it, and you could not penetrate below that fill, or there'd be major mojo stuff going on. So we had a very simple footprint, the simple bar with local quarried stone, because our cash crop in northwest Arkansas is rocks. We have lots of those. And then the other material is copper, timeless material, everything wrapped in copper, and a series of programmatic, kind of choreographed programmatic sequence that finds itself to the exterior. And then surprises on the inside that you wouldn't normally expect to find in a golf clubhouse, a very nice wet area with a skylit whirlpool. This was published in Arc Daily about 3 or 4 years ago, and somebody wrote on the blog, I love these anonymous blogs, it's like, "Oh, Peter Zumthor called and wants his baths back." And I was like, geez, I didn't think of that. And then somebody wrote after it, says, "Yeah, and the Romans called Peter because they want their baths back." So, it just shows that we're all in a continuum, right? And in the way in which we work, and we learn from the past and we learn from the present as well. And so, when I was first approached about this, and this is the value, I think, of having really astute, good clients. He said, "So I want you to do this clubhouse." And I said, "Man, I don't know how to play golf. I don't know anything about golf. I'm dangerous with a golf club. I could hurt myself and others." He goes, "Man, it's not about golf." He said, "A golf clubhouse is about people and space." I was like, "Well, I can do that." So when you learn from your clients just as well. Of course, if you want to be an architect, I think you got to build your own house at some point. You got to put you got to put your stuff on the table, right? So, I always said that when I was a student at Auburn, I would never own a house that I didn't design and build myself, which is really a kind of dumb idea because I rented until I was 50. Not a good business model, I might add. But we did eventually, my wife and I, who's my partner, Ati and I bought a property in downtown Fayetteville, property nobody wanted, that had a creek running diagonally through it. So we lived about a year and a half next door trying to figure out how to deal with this creek, how to come up with a footprint for a 2,500 square foot house on a 9,000 square foot site. And we developed this very simple diagram of two stacked boxes, 18 foot wide. One bridges over the creek, the other is rotated 90 degrees back into the site to maintain the scale of the neighborhood. We call it the L-stack house. And it's all clad in Brazilian redwood, a rain screen that it worked with Dan Rockhill at Studio 804, kind of introduced us to how we might be able to do this. Very tedious process cladding. We call it the Cro-Magnon cladding system. But and of course, all of these pieces are on edge like stacked stone and are toe-nailed from below into a jig with 13,000 stainless steel screws. And I paid this guy to paint each one of them black, which he was able to do with his crew in 4 days. And then we were asked to lose his phone number when he was done. But nonetheless, not very nice effect. And it all comes together with this rake of a I just left. Bad thing that you don't do, which is leave your phone on. This transparent stairway that really, perceptually, you think you're going outside to go back inside, and that is the hinge that connects all this together. And there you see. And just to point out very quickly that for us, all details are spatial propositions. So elements, things like doors, windows, columns, have the opportunity to be occupied, not just perceptually, but even physically. This is a window that cantilevers out over the lake and is the daybed for our living room, because my partner claims that she is the queen of lounge, and that's where she hangs out over her dynasty there at the house. Now, working typologically, again, thinking about what you can do in the event of a disaster. This is a post-Katrina house that we did in Biloxi, Mississippi, with Architecture for Humanity, supported by Oprah Winfrey and Autodesk. What a collaboration that was. Now, what you may not know is Biloxi was the only town in the Mississippi Gulf Coast that essentially rejected the new urbanist plan for that. Now, I'm not sure all the reasons why, but somebody said, well, they think they decided not everybody wants to live in grandma's house with a geranium on the porch, that they were really looking for more serious proposals about how to deal with the new FEMA regulations. And the new FEMA regulations are demanding 6 to 12 feet, things to be built up above a Category 4 storm surge, depending on where you're located in the city. Now, the implications urbanistically of that are pretty dire in some ways. And we certainly knew that some things may go up, but some things down. And one of those was the porch itself, that social interface between the private world of the house and the public world of the street, which is so important, especially here in the South. So this little series of diagrams, we start with the shotgun here, which is what we were asked to do as a kind of typological reference. And we keep the porch grounded, but rather than just take the sort of long, how would you say, shotgun and put it on stilts, which creates a kind of a lot of residual space at the ground floor, we decided to stack the program to make it more concise, where car can pull in or have storage, and then that evolved into what we call the porch dog house. And this was a prototype that was built for $130 a square foot. In other words, it could be repeated, a market rate house, which is very different from what's happening at Make It Right, where houses are being built for up to $500,000, subsidized for $30,000 mortgages. They beat on their chest that they're net zero, and they're essentially unicorns. They cannot be repeated. And I know you're not supposed to beat up on Brad Pitt because he's a good guy and everything, but that's the reality. And this is something that can be repeated, and it has a lot of just common sense stuff to it. You know, sliding metal screens that control the east and west light, but also can be locked in place to create security, to allow a sense of well-being when you flee the next storm, that everything isn't going to be looted. How I get up into the house with a perforated stair, whereas the waters rise, rather than creating undue pressure on this access, it rises above it and flows right back out. So just a couple common sense things. And I always love showing, this is the Katrina cottage that was presented, and I realize it was early on, but I can assure you that if they're in the next category 4 storm, which structure will be there and which one will not. So again, for me, this comes out of thinking typologically as something that's more fixed and something more dynamic. And that's where our head is at. Now, this idea of the porch as something that you can build ideas and a language even around has been informing some of our other work in the South here, especially in Memphis. We've been working with James Corner Field Operations on a large urban park in Memphis called Shelby Farms. It's a former farm, 4,500 acres. And they've been on it for probably 5-6 years. We've been on it for a couple of years, but we've been asked to do 7 structures around an expanded lake that they've been doing. Our visitor center, a restaurant retreat center, a boat kiosk, stage pavilion, picnic pavilions, bathrooms, all of these things. So we wanted to develop an ensemble of figures that would be informed by this typology of the porch and the big agricultural shed. And that was at least a place to begin. And so we developed, like I said, you see some of the profiles here of this ensemble, and the mothership being, of course, the visitor center. And you know, this is the place where we started with the existing lake and the pastures. Again, an old farm. They got a buffalo herd here. You have to be walk gingerly around because they're very kind of ornery. This is the current visitor center, which we convinced immediately to tear down because it's really awful, and put the new visitor center looking the lake with unadulterated views of the lake and the landscape to the south. And so our proposal is a giant cantilevered porch that has a building in it. It's kind of the way we describe it. All made out of bar grate and trusses. Worked with Guy Nordensson, a really good structural engineer out of New York, to get all this working. And it's basically a series of dog trots where you move from a type of orchard that Corner's office did, and then you move through the dog trot underneath the porch. And then because you're in Memphis, like Atlanta, it gets really hot in the summer. Standing in the shade, you can still sweat like a pig. So we have 5 giant 20-foot big-ass fans that ventilate the shade here and allow for programmed activities to go on even in the very heat of the summer. And then at night, we light it up, and it turns into this nice jellyfish-like figure on the hill. And then another figure is the stage pavilion, which has activities on the lakeside as well as in the kind of amphitheater. We use a palette of second-growth cypress that can be locally sourced, zinc-like materials, metal panels, excuse me. So that's this particular figure, and then a small figure of the boat kiosk with its bar grate box filled with kayaks and canoes and a concession stand out front. Our picnic pavilions, we like to call the crickets, that are kind of hopping around the landscape, creating shade. And then the restaurant retreat center, all with bar grade zinc metal and the local stone. And the kitchen is going to be moving here, which is an outfit out of Denver that does farm to table. And so we'll have, it'll basically be sitting amongst a kind of a farm or agriculture. And then with its great porch that organizes the multi-purpose event and the restaurant and creates that edge along the lake, setting up views to the west and the sunsets. And then at night, of course, lots of nice activities on the lake. So this starts construction this week. We're really excited about that. But again, it begins to embody a lot of things we're trying to do typologically and formally with our work. And so taking that even further into the idea of a forest structure where it's really about the canopy and the floor. We've done a visitor center for the Indianapolis Museum of Art's 100-acre Art and Nature Park in Indianapolis. It was completed in 2010. This is a really tough site. It's in the oxbow of the White River that runs through downtown Indianapolis. It has a canal also that runs through downtown Indianapolis that comes through here. That's the Museum of Art. So you get 100 acres essentially as a peninsula island. And in the middle of it, it used to be a forest and then became a pasture. And then it became a rock quarry to take the limestone out to build the interstate through the middle of the city. And then that quarry filled up with water, as you can see down here, and now it's an amenity in the city. So it's a very volatile site between land and water. This is the river you see in the distance there that rises above the lake and breaches into the lake. They've had 3 100-year floods in the last 7 years. That's a lot to do with indiscriminate development upriver. So we had to contend with this volatility, both in terms of the landscape and in terms of any art or architecture that what we might put in here. And of course, working with Ed Blake, who's a really great landscape architect who passed away recently, but was like a big brother. We worked with him and environmental artist Mary Miss to develop a series of pathway journeys that begin to explain what's going on here in terms of that relationship between art and nature, some of the different types of art, more phenomenal art, plazas with repurposed wood, bridges and topaz, all to create this network of journeys. And our structure, well, we had to locate. And what we discovered was out of 100 acres, if you take the lake away, you had 64 acres. And if you factored in all the floodplains, floodways, easements, zoning, and all that, we had 0.67 acres to build on. So not too difficult to find your place there. So which for us was either here or here. So we picked here. And this is really just, we saw our structures embedded in the wood and just really not a destination itself, but an extension of the pathway journeys. Our site, wet and fecund, underwater. We were being required by FEMA to take this out of the forest floor by 5 feet, so right at eye level. A bit of a dilemma there. But working with Ed Blake, who'd seen my early sketches, he came up with a really brilliant idea of how to do that, which is a set of figured mounds that would rise about 3.5 feet up. And these mounds pointed mounds would point you to a particular view through the woods. And then our structure, with its big long ADA ramps, would rise up out of the pathway journeys and sit astride this mound and kind of float just above it. And then there it is today. So just a very kind of subtle structure embedded in the woods, and then you discover more as you get closer and underneath the structure itself. So we were looking at everything from anything we could, really. This is a microscopic image of the wing of a butterfly. I kept finding these leaves on site that had been eaten away by insects, which had this wonderful surface, this condition of porosity, but the structure was left intact. And so I began to ask the question, could we develop a structure that would allow light and water and air to move through it, just like both this way and this way, just like the canopy of the trees can. So that was the analog. And then provide a really tough structure, an exoskeleton. And so we had an idea that we would use one material and essentially one detail, one primary detail to make this whole structure. So I'm going to show you this little animation that illustrates the conceptual idea. a surface that you would walk on that would form a wall, and then the canopy. So here's the animation. All right, thank you. So I'll try again. If you missed it, there you go. So it just unfolds and then wraps around the program a lounge, a glass vitrine, and then this sidebar here of bathrooms, and it's got a kitchen and other services for the park. So it's just like a big taco or enchilada or whatever here, okay? And then there's the project here. So that material is 2x4 Ipe, which is on its edge. It acts as a type of screen, a surface, and then the structure is the exoskeleton that you don't really see, but you feel the presence of through its shadow. And so that shadow is in constant movement because it registers the intensity of the light, right? And how it moves and pulsates with the rhythms of the day and the season. So this is always constantly moving, going quiet, coming back to life, and it's a very dynamic surface. And then the deck that we had to resolve for the code was a matter of inserting 1x2 UVA rated acrylic bars side screwed to each Ipe member, and then we would light that from the bottom, and it comes this type of apparition in the woods. And it all comes together right here with the glass vitrine, the black box, which is made out of charred cedar, which makes it rot resistant and resistant to insects and fireproof to some degree when it's all charred like that. And then you can see we're actually pleating the system of slats, not just punching a hole in to create these oculi that allow for an intensity of light, water, and snow. And on the inside, the water pop ebonized white oak that has a very kind of fixed finish, and then the wrapper, which is really turns silver over time because it weathers naturally. And that's it. In its place, it's all silver with the black box sitting undisturbed in the woods. And then the old killer shot at the end, and I think the first winner of a National AIA Award for the city of Indianapolis. So that was something we were proud of. It's quite loved, but lots of ideas and so forth coming from this notion that you can take one unit of dimensional lumber or wood, and you, by repeating it in a systematic way, you can make a whole system of articulation, a whole language. And so taking that idea, we carried it to the inside in a museum store at the Crystal Bridges Museum of Art, which is probably the most significant museum of American art since the Whitney Museum, and it's in Bentonville, Arkansas, of all places, built by Moshe Softy back in 2011. And we had the opportunity to do the museum store that really was conceived to be a retail experience that would be an extension of the museum experience. So the museum, now we were under construction at the time, so we really didn't know what it was going to look like so much. It was just a series of platonic and geometric forms around a creek that had been dammed and then bridging over some of the gallery, thus the name Crystal Bridges. We were given this crescent here, empty white space, not a great space I might add, by Mr. Softy. And this is it. Concrete columns every so often to support a green roof, and western facing sun. Lots of fun there. So what to do? And we kept thinking again about our material culture, especially in this part of Arkansas, which really has a lot to do with our hardwood forest, and how we might refine that material into some kind of unit that we could multiply into an architecture, being very inspired obviously by Thorncrown. And so we came up with a carapace that is hung from the ceiling, essentially, of the empty space, that's made out of 265 cherry plywood ribs, which comes out of 475 sheets of plywood, all optimized to minimize waste. All of this comes directly from our BIM files to a 3-axis CNC. So everything in the space that you're going to see is manufactured through customization and through a CNC machine. And then this is it here. So we're obscuring all the infrastructure like sprinklers and ductwork. We're controlling that, creating a new sectional profile, and we're embedding merchandise in the envelope that then wraps around and provides a sort of ground for these figures of the gondolas and the vitrines, all of that merchandise now located at eye level. So you see here there's some baskets which we knew were going to be featured, local artists would be featured, and one of those is the great basket maker Leon Niehaus, who's from Huntsville, Arkansas. And we went to his studio just to visit with him, see his work. We were really impressed with it. And we noticed that he was drawing every basket on newsprint with charcoal in profile. And then he would extrude that profile along a path, sort of in plan. And then how it began to complete itself in section and in plan created the three-dimensional character for each of these baskets. So this action of operation of profile and path really informed some of the very early sketches I was working on to find a way to negotiate the sun, about 40% of the western sun, and baffle that, but begin to cover, like I was saying before, the infrastructure, embed merchandise, and then skew that along the profile or the path of the room, I should say. And that involved into a series of these ribs where all the connections are intricately milled into every rib. And then each one of these ribs is different because it runs parallel across the curve. So when we had to do this for $600,000, this museum store, we calculated it, had we done it by hand, working with the contractor, it would have been over $1 million. So it really began to underscore the value of these new fabrication techniques that we have at our disposal here. So again, the store here that terminates in this soft green fabric wall. This is Adam with his 3-axis CNC. And what this guy does on most every day is make newel posts in cabinetry. So this is a real challenge and a real opportunity that he sort of seized upon, even milling in the dado joints to put the ribs together. Here's all of the ribs laid out in an array, which is every piece, like I say, very different. We numbered all of those, they milled in all the numbers and how to put it together. Then we got these two old guys to hang it in the air like, they said it was like hanging stone in a way, just stacking it. They too asked us to lose their phone number when they were done. Kind of too unusual. If you want to be an architect, you have to be really good at post-rationalization. So that's something we take great pride in our office. Somebody said, look at it this one day and said, man, it looks just like our museum store. And so, yeah, so the underside of a mushroom, we call it the lamella. We use that to illustrate to the owner some of the diagrams of why things don't radiate, but why they're parallel to control the gaps between. And here it baffles the light. You see it under construction. It was really a lovely process to see go up because everything was indeed manufactured like a kit of parts. And then the final piece with the big giant cash wrap, which is the nerve center. And then that whole transition from the horizontal to the vertical, all integrally fabricated in. Now, this store paid for itself in 4 months from its profits. So we were able to demonstrate to the owner, who happened to be Alice Walton, that indeed good design could be good business. And as a result, we've gotten a lot more business. So we only have 2 ideas. I just, we rub them together like sticks and, something comes out of that. So we thought, well, let's try this on another project. And we had an opportunity at the Renwick Gallery at the Smithsonian to redesign their grand salon into an architectural destination in the city that could be a multi-purpose, multi-event space. We were invited, it was an invited competition. We were one of 5, and so we're really quite excited about this. And the Renwick Gallery is the one building of the Smithsonian located closest to the White House. This is the Grand Salon you see in the upper left, filled with art. We could take all of that out and insert our installation, which would last for 5 years. And we went there expecting to see a lot of, Tiffany and all that old, I don't know what you call it, tchotchke-looking stuff. Totally wrong, absolutely wrong we were. We got there and we saw wonderful craft, wonderful artifacts, and some very new stuff as well that were taking on the new technologies. So we're quite inspired by that. Simultaneously, in order to, in which is, I think, as students you'll find the toughest thing about a project is how to start it. And a lot of times we do look at origins. We try to go back in time. I learned that from my landscape architect friend who, he never started a project less than 60 million years back. We don't go back that far, but we at least went back to in this case, the origins in DC about the evolution of the city, and much of it being forest and swamp, a lot of it anyway. And so we thought what would be interesting maybe is to bring the forest, a new type of environment, or the old environment, back to the city in an abstracted form. And we knew there was a swamp that was residual of this geographic location left over called the Great Pocomoke Swamp about 100 miles away. And they would let you harvest selectively certain trees. So we thought, man, maybe we could those and bring them back in some form. And so this is what you would see right crawling up the top of the steps about to go into the gallery. So there's DC here, the Pocomoke Swamp, again, all part of this one geological area, some of the different types of trees, sinker logs, but you could cultivate up to like 14-inch cypress. And then we calculated how much veneer, because we want to do everything out of thin veneer and create a new epidermis for the space and backlight that veneer. So it has this skin-like quality. And so we came up with the idea of developing lanterns, nearly 600 lanterns that would be hung from the top, because you couldn't mess with the floor because it had to have all these different events there. But we thought we could wrap the sides and the top with this skin and these lanterns. And we calculated that we just need 6 logs to do this with the veneer. But now we also wanted to do plank floors, cypress for the floor and the end walls, and that was going to take another 45 logs. So, but a total of 50 logs, 8 inches to 14 inches to do this with. And we looked at a variety of types of lanterns and settled on one. And we wanted all the lanterns to be put together with mechanical fasteners, very simple rivets. And so that was why the shape of them were in this kind of bilaterally symmetrical way, very simple pod-like characters, and then set them into an array hanging from the ceiling, up to nearly 6 feet wide, 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, and over 6-7 feet tall. And put them in such a way that we kind of maintain some of the proportions of the existing space, and as you see here, and then inserting the system. A very stable, kind of beautiful backlit skin and the canopy above. Now the trick is that every single one of these lanterns is actually on a motion actuator. And there are sensors that when you move into the space, as you see, there are no people here, but when you move in, it reconfigures it. It responds to the movement in the room. So the idea was to imbue the space with the order of change. And it could be responsive and reactive in real time, but also could be programmed for certain types of events, for acoustics or for certain types of lighting. So that was the idea here. And so we just looked at the range of motion that we would need for these things to move up and down. And like I say, each one's on individual actuator, and it's all powered by photovoltaics on the roof in a kind of very discrete way. And then where we have a lecture event. We worked with Richard Renfro, really great lighting designer out of New York, that showed us how to strategize and put all of these in a very stealth way with the lighting. Again, lighting between, lighting behind, but never actually seeing the source of the light. So a great sense of mystery in the space. Here, it's movie night, banquet night, fashion night. That's my favorite night right there. So we were really excited about this project, and we got to present it live in DC to the Smithsonian. And we wanted to talk to them about the systems, because the way the airflow had to be dealt with. Working with Guy Nordenson again, he came up with this aluminum ribbed cage system that would not attach to the existing, so it was like a Trojan horse, inserted piece by piece into the room, and then we skinned the inside liner. And you could reconfigure it in multiple ways. So there were topographies that we also studied. We have our own sort of MakerBot in the office, so we kind of started making these using just the plastic, and then we pushed on and started making them out of resin and backlighting them to try to really understand the effect. Really felt just greatly prepared. This is a section model that we did to illustrate it. So to go in and be prepared to win this commission, what you got to do for a competition sometime. And then we showed them this image. And first of all, we were told there would be 6 people in the room and we would present, and they were really excited. We were going last, which is really a great thing to do when you're competition. We walked into the room, and there were 40 tired bureaucrats looking at their phone. And we're like, uh-oh. And they've been there all day, and they're exhausted. And then we start showing our stuff, and then we come to this image, and somebody goes, "We don't do weddings here." I'm like, uh-oh. "Oh, I thought you didn't know. We don't do weddings." Oh, boy. Needless to say, we didn't win. And I was really pissed off. Because who did win was a group, non-architects, who brilliant idea was to shoot images on the walls. It's like, oh, God, this is terrible. Victim of the image again. But we tried to look at it in a positive way, and I think, when you do competitions, you have to kind of look at it this way. They are investments in your spiritual savings bank. So you can draw upon them later. These ideas become useful. It's really a sort of a test case for how you think about architecture and the possibilities. You don't always win, but I firmly believe, just like those early projects, we're preparing for those commissions to come. So I want to finish up with looking at an aspect of sustainable practices. You hear a lot about that. We're not really big into bamboo floors and things like that in our office, or the sort of moral badge of honor that often comes with the commodification of sustainability, the greenwashing of things. But we are very interested in our place and in our city, in the repurposing of fabric that already exists and how we might provide the past with the future. This was clearly illustrated to us in a story that I had heard about William J. Fulbright, whose family owned a mill in Fayetteville, Arkansas, where they made farm implements like plow handles, axe handles, wagon wheels, and another person from Fayetteville, Arkansas, who was building a fine arts complex, the first one in the U.S., on the campus of Arkansas, University of Arkansas, in 1950. His name was Edward Durell Stone. They were both friends. Their families were friends. And they were having a conversation. Mr. Fulbright was saying, I don't know what we're going to do with all our plow handles and axe handle stuff, because nobody's really wanting them much anymore, and we're having a surplus. And Mr. Stone said, well, I have an idea. So why don't we repurpose these instruments as an international line of furniture? And we can put it in the fine arts complex, and we can also market it. So these, this shows you what to do, some of the plow handles that become a chair, wagon wheel that becomes these really great stools, using local Ozark traditions of the basket making. The white oak bark becomes the rattan for these chase lounges made out of plowshares. And so this whole line of furniture emerges from a simple idea of repurposing and taking the DNA of what already is and speculating on its future. I really love that. Of course, today, if you can find one of these chairs on eBay or something, they're like $20,000. But so this was a great setup for us for thinking of the work we're doing in the small towns in Arkansas, like a town of Gentry, Arkansas, where we were asked to do a library. Now, they had a public library, but it was privately funded. And this is a town of 2,500. They have one industry in town. It's a Little Debbie snack food plant. So if you like oatmeal cakes, this is the place to go. And they also had a wild country safari zoo where you drive through the landscape and monkeys and emus chase your car and stuff. Very bizarre. Love it. Now, we're in a tough downtown that has seen better days. They had to the ownership of this building, which was the former hardware store, had a 100-year-old hardware store that was no longer in use. I think they got it for $1, and it's right on the corner of Main Street. And they said, can you turn this into a public library? And I was like, absolutely. Once we finish tearing down the building and starting over, because it'll be much cheaper. I'm doing my due diligence, right? Best practice. We know that this is a quagmire. But they were offended by that. They were like, no, 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 you don't get, there's a lot of sentimentality here about this building. Socio-economic hub of our community for years. And the mayor who was in the conversation piped up and said, yeah, I used to eat barbecued beaver right out of that storefront there. So we'll eat anything in Arkansas. Now, the building has developed a lot of ticks and wrinkles over the last 100 years. It's in Tornado Alley. It's been hit by storms, bricks blown off, parapet blown off, and patched together with whatever they had laying around. And all the windows blown out, as you can see, for the most part. So what to do? So after weeks and weeks of thinking about what to do, and they didn't want a false history, which to their credit, they didn't want that thing we do too often in our cities, is provide the history that never was. We said, well, what could we do? So lots of torn up trays, lots of little study models, lots of kicking trash cans and throwing fits and all that when you're not getting anywhere. And about 2 or 3 weeks later, it sort of dawned on me, said, you know, maybe we shouldn't do a whole lot. Maybe this building as an artifact, as an everyday artifact, could be elevated just by the way that we reframe it, that we represent it. Because all they wanted was a public library, a community room, a genealogy department, and a way to display some of the artifacts from the city's history. So we came up with a series of details, a new syntax. These are the soap bubble glass windows that slipped over the existing openings that we don't infill with glass at all. You leave the building as a ruin. New columns, new windows, new doors, new storefront, all of a similar kind of very minimal language. And so these elements create the new expressive character for the building, even a new parapet of a steel channel. This is the old one, the corbel that had been blown off in the earlier in the 1900s. And we did all of this for $110 a square foot. Still the least expensive public library in the state of Arkansas. Took 7 years to build, from conception to realization. It had to be rebid 3 times. I mean, it was really difficult. Small town politics, I know most people have never dealt with that, but if you have, you'll never forget it. This is the mayor, really tough town, that's the mayor. He owns a tattoo parlor. His name is Wes Hogue, one of the most brilliant politicians I've ever met, and he helped navigate us through this. One of the city council members read on my CV that I had taught 1 year at Syracuse. So they refer to me as that city slicker from New York, even though I had lived in Arkansas for the last 20 years or so. So in any event, we were able to get this through. It's very simple. The stacks and the reading areas are on the first floor, the community room here, up above, the genealogy department and historical displays. And then the librarian's office, she doesn't really like people, she said, so she was up by herself up here. She liked books, okay. And then a small little leftover piece of land that became the Little Debbie Pocket Park, and then a little plaza, and then a future home for their antique fire truck. And then it lights up at night, becomes really a lantern in the middle of the city here. And so this diagram just shows this brick chassis, essentially. We use some of the existing structure, but we really just created a whole kit of parts that we could use to create new identity. Even this beacon that goes over the existing skylight opening really becomes a marker for the center of town. We've been working on this for a while, where we take glass and put it over steel with structural sealant, and then we build wood forms in reverse and let it cure for 28 days, just like concrete, and then take out the forms, and the glass just hangs in there like a shingle. And it's a very taut soap bubble, almost shrink-wrapped approach to making fenestration. Creates this transparent interface between the street and the inside. You see the pressed tin ceiling, which was original. So the mayor got his county prisoners to come over, take each one down, one by one, and label them, and then they were restored off-site. We couldn't penetrate it with light or HVAC. So what we did is we had to replace the columns, these Mesian crosshair columns, wrapped in books, wrapped in glass, and then light put in the bottom, shooting up, bouncing off the ceiling to create the ambient light for the reading areas. All locally made furniture, the mechanical lift, which becomes an exhibit. They used to have buggies at the top that would be bought and brought down and hooked up to horses, so one of those were donated. But just to give an example. Upstairs, heart pine floors restored, the I Don't Like People librarian in her deal. And just a way of, just a strategy, taking existing openings and creating light boxes that bend the north light around into the space where a prosaic element sets up the opportunity for a more spiritual interface with this simple book. So we're very pleased with the building. I think the town was as well. It was the first National Library Award winner for the state of Arkansas. There's been some now that have followed. But the greatest sense of success we had with this building was that when we started, there were 300 library card holders in the town of Gentry. Today, there are 2,300 library card holders in this town of 2,500. So it really goes to illustrate that architecture, while it may not be able to transform institutions, it certainly can strengthen them. And that, I think is obviously a very positive thing. So the last project I want to share with you is a project we've just recently completed about a year and a half ago, which is the new architecture school for the University of Arkansas, the Fay Jones School of Architecture. Now, we've been in this architecture school, which was the old Beaux-Arts library for the campus, for 40 years. But we've never had the ability to have interiors and landscape under one roof. Now, I won't go into how the director of the program got the commission to do this. That's a whole nother animal. All ethical and above board, right, Richard? Yeah. Okay, thank you. He was on the design review board, so. Nonetheless, we got the opportunity for the commission. We teamed with Polk Stanley Wilcox, great firm out of Little Rock, and we were asked to take this Beaux-Arts facade here and wing and not replicate it, but at least make it, whatever we did to the west, this is the east side, is make it the same width and length. Of course, replicating this on that side, which some people wanted us to do, we thought would be anathema for the 21st century architecture school, although Notre Dame might disagree. Bless their hearts. So how do you do that? How do you deal with the old and new? How do you develop this condition of resonance? For us, it's about observation, careful observation, looking at the original, the regulating lines, the proportions, the language, and using that to inform how we proportioned our edition, using similar materials. The Indiana limestone here is also here, but except it comes in the form of a rain screen, an open joint rain screen with very thin panels, very tall. We were going to use the original quarry, but thanks to LEED, we couldn't because we were 50 miles outside of the 500-mile radius. God bless them. So we found another quarry so we could, it's a LEED gold building, so we had to do all that good stuff. So to do this, this is the original building, and we knew that the core of the building, while had some nice spaces, all had some really crappy spaces too, because it was mostly filled with books during its time as a library. So to do this, we had to core out the center, core out the creamy nougat, so to speak, reprogram that center, and then add our addition to it. So this campus building goes from a T to an H or an I. So it maintains its figural presence in the center of campus. And then we had to demonstrate this viability of the new to the design review board. And we really saw this as a didactic moment in which our students could learn from how we used to build to how we build now. And we illustrated that indeed the existing building, its mass could be understood as the ground and its fenestration as the figure. Today, with new materials, new technologies, new ways of thinking about form and space, we can actually make the building the figure and the fenestration the ground. And that inversion, I think, created an opportunity, a learning opportunity, and I think that was appreciated. This is all post-tension concrete. It's the main frame. There's only like 3 columns in the entire building. Most everything is done with walls, poché, but it is a weighty counterweight to the heaviness of this building. We didn't want to go with steel frame and layers, so to speak. And it lights up at night, so often architecture schools beg the question, what the hell's going on in there? It's on, the lights are on all the time, you can't get in there. It's like a form of an asylum, right? So in this case, we wanted people to see in. It opens up. It's like a jellyfish. You can see inside. We also had to correct The axis that runs through campus from Arkansas Avenue through Old Main, our oldest building, through the library, one of buildings, through the new library, across the Union, or the Union Plaza, new Student Union, all the way to the football stadium. But you never could do this because you always had to go around because of all those crappy spaces in the middle. Now it's opened up. This is the new western entrance, or axis, that runs through the building. We had 2 100-year red oak trees we had to take down for the new addition. So we carefully limbed those, cut them into 2-foot wide planks of lumber, and then this really great woodworker, Fletcher Cox, out of Jackson, Mississippi, helped us turn those wood into a tableau where we can teach our students about face grain, end grain, long grain, and it sits right in the middle of that axis, 25 feet long by 5 feet wide. We've had bands play on this, we have art installations, or people can just hang out on it with similarly proportioned vitrines for all the student work. This is the existing lobby, not so good, all replastered. These new vitrines act as lanterns. They actually provide the light in the new lobby. And going down to the lower floor, new studios on the south side where the hill slopes down, so these are embedded with eastern light. And of course the shop and Viz Lab and materials laboratory, what we like to call the candy store, is all here, all very transparent. Upstairs on the ground level where all the public services are, where the campus now, we're unified with the community of the campus, a exhibition gallery for traveling exhibits, the first one, and just exhibits locally. The first one was retrospective on Faye Jones, newly renovated studios with new lighting, restored windows, new desks, built-in LEDs. Upstairs on the second floor, the former reading room becomes a giant studio for our first year, where interior, landscape, and architecture are brought together under one roof. Custom lighting, new desk, we preserved and restrained, but we didn't save everything. We didn't save every stencil, just because it's old, don't make it good, I can tell you. Nasty looking stuff in there. So we cleaned all that up. New classrooms, and then a central gallery where our reviews had always taken place, and now we wanted to make that more of a multi-purpose space. The problem with it is that it had poor lighting and poor acoustics and what to do, and we needed space too. So we blew off the roof of it and put studios up above, and then stretched a fabric ceiling across, and backlit it, so it's like one big giant lampshade, and then cored out a oculus, we call it a retoculus, through the middle of it. It's all red lined, and red for lots of reasons. Arkansas colors not being withstanding one of those. Skylight, a window to the sky in the middle of the building. And then this is the place in which reviews take place and other events. And then skylit around the perimeter with opalux. And then one big slot through the old wall where all the panels can roll out, be stored, and then you create this flexible, usable space. And the fabric is also slightly perforated, so it really resolves a lot of the acoustical issues that we once had. So the old and new really overlap here and become that other condition. We always try to do full-scale mock-ups if we can. In this case, looking at how we develop a brise-soleil to handle 200-foot long elevation of western sun, finding the right configuration for the brise-soleil, developing strategies to make all of the windows in the new addition to be custom steel curtain wall made 10 miles away. We did that by separating between the glass and the steel fabricators, saved millions of dollars, got the university to buy in, which was unprecedented. And so there really is a resonance with the old and new here, and all, like I say, locally made fritted glass, brise-soleil, and that one big window here that organizes the entire western elevation and really brings in a lot of north light. And that's light that we can balance out on the inside in the studios with their exposed concrete structure. And then, like I said, at night it lights up like a beacon. It's that jellyfish sort of look we wanted. And then the joint between the old and new is actually a program joint. This is a joint of the old stairs, the new stairs, I should say, exit stairs that also create opportunities for socializing here. Everything is decentralized plotter sinks that are behind these sliding homosoap panels that can be closed up for review spaces. Our auditorium, 200-seat auditorium with its brise-soleil that you fill up with people. Of course, shades can come down and darken if need be. Underneath the rake of the auditorium is our student lounge, all lined in felt, wood and red glass. We call this the boneless chicken ranch. It's where you go to find students in beanbag chairs sleeping, hanging out. We have showers as well. So it's a really to be. Actually, some students took advantage of that, and we found 2 of them living rent-free between studio, this room, and the shower. So we had to kind of correct that. But it's a split-screen system. And the reason for that is to kind of, well, one reason for it was I taught at Cornell a few years ago, and I love REM's building, but nobody sits in the first 5 rows because they didn't resolve the sight lines there. So it's always empty. Makes you feel alone if you're lecturing. So what we did is split it, so you'd have 2 screens, get all that resolved, but then steal space behind it so we could have our faculty lounge here where we go and gossip about the students. And then finally, up top, nice green roof, faculty offices, seminar rooms. The green roof becomes a laboratory for studying Ozarks sedums, and then an outdoor covered classroom, which really presents a place of refuge and prospect, where you can have teaching going on, and then the views to the Boston Mountains to the south. And then really like this image because you really can see the lineage of the oldest building and that next generation, and now the new generation all kind of working together. And finally, the space I always tell students to go to after they've been up for a few nights, go to the red vitrine, stare into the red vitrine. It's better than 5 Red Bulls, and get charged up, get back to work. So I'll end with this. Every year I always go and do the Halloween reviews at the Rural Studio because it's my alma mater. We always have to go in costume. I'm always dressed as the Grim Reaper for whatever reasons. But I like to sit on this bench in front of the local general store and just harass the folks coming out. I like to sing "You Are My Sunshine" to them. Just acting as an irritant to remind them that everything isn't okay in some ways. But what I hope I've been able to do, at least today anyway, is to demonstrate that there is humor and inspiration and dignity in the world as it's given to us. And I hope in some ways that we can contribute to that world in the way in which we find it through the things that we make. Thank you very much.